After the Great Flood, the Bible presents humanity as beginning again from a single family. Noah and his sons step into a world that has been emptied, reshaped, and reset. From this point forward, Genesis shifts its focus away from individual survival and towards something broader, the formation of peoples. This video explores how the Bible describes the origins of African peoples, not through modern ideas of race or nationality, but through ancient groupings of lineage, land, and memory found in Scripture. In Genesis, Africa is never named as a continent in the modern sense. Instead, the Bible speaks in terms of regions, descendants, and ancestral lines. These descriptions appear most clearly in Genesis 10, often called the Table of Nations. Rather than a map with borders, this chapter reads like a genealogical worldview, organizing humanity according to families that spread across known regions of the ancient world. Within this framework, African peoples are primarily associated with the line of Ham, one of Noah's 3 sons. The Bible introduces Ham not as a representative of a race, but as a patriarch whose descendants would inhabit specific lands. Genesis lists Ham's sons as Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Each name is connected not only to a family line, but also to territories that ancient readers would have recognized. Cush is often associated with regions south of Egypt, frequently linked to areas along the Nile and beyond. Mizraim is closely tied to Egypt itself, a land that would become central to later biblical narratives. Put is associated with territories west of Egypt, while Canaan represents a region along the eastern Mediterranean coast. What is striking in the biblical account is that these names function as both people and place. The Bible does not separate ethnicity from geography in the way modern thought does. Instead, a people is defined by where they dwell, how they move, and who their ancestors are. In this sense, African peoples in Scripture are not presented as a single group, but as a cluster of related lineages spread across a broad and diverse region. Genesis does not describe physical appearance, skin color, or biological traits. These modern categories are absent from the text. Instead, the focus remains on descent and dispersion. The Bible is concerned with how humanity spreads out after the flood, how families settle into lands, and how these settlements form the foundation of later civilizations. African peoples, as described in Genesis, emerge as some of the earliest and most influential groups in the post-flood world. Egypt, linked to Mizraim, quickly becomes one of the most powerful and enduring civilizations in the biblical narrative. Cush appears repeatedly in later texts, sometimes associated with wealth, military strength, and distant lands. These references suggest that the regions connected to Ham's descendants were not marginal or secondary. On the contrary, they were central to the ancient world as the Bible understood it. At the same time, the biblical text remains notably restrained. It does not explain why certain groups settled where they did, nor does it assign moral or spiritual value based on lineage alone. While later traditions and interpretations would attempt to read deeper meanings into these genealogies, Genesis itself offers no explicit hierarchy among peoples. It simply presents a world that is spreading outward, diversifying, and becoming increasingly complex. This raises an important question. If the Bible groups African peoples through shared ancestry and geography, what was the purpose of this classification? Some scholars suggest that Genesis 10 functions as a theological map, showing how all known peoples are connected through a single origin. Others view it as a way for ancient Israel to situate itself within a wider human family, surrounded by related but distinct groups. From this perspective, African peoples are not portrayed as outsiders. They are part of the same post-flood story, emerging alongside the descendants of Shem and Japheth. The division is not one of value, but of distribution. Humanity spreads across the earth, filling different regions, adapting to different environments, and forming distinct identities rooted in shared ancestry. It is also important to note what Genesis does not say. It does not claim that modern Africans descend exclusively or directly from these ancient figures in a biological sense. The Bible is not offering a genetic chart. It is offering a narrative framework shaped by ancient understanding. The peoples described in Genesis 10 reflect how the world was perceived by those who preserved these texts, not a scientific explanation of human diversity. Over time, these early groupings would fracture, merge, migrate, and transform. The Bible itself acknowledges this complexity as later books introduced new nations, shifting alliances, and changing boundaries. What remains consistent is the idea that humanity, despite its divisions, shares a common origin and a shared history. By presenting African peoples through lineage and land rather than race, the Bible invites readers to reconsider how identity was understood in the ancient world. Identity was relational, geographical, and historical. It was shaped by memory and movement, not by fixed biological categories. This approach also prepares the ground for what comes next in the biblical narrative. As humanity spreads, differences increase. Languages diverge, cultures emerge. The story moves toward Babel, where unity gives way to fragmentation in a dramatic and symbolic way. The origins of African peoples, as described in Genesis, belong to this larger movement of dispersion that defines the post-flood world. In the end, the Bible does not offer a final answer to who African peoples are in modern terms. Instead, it provides a lens through which ancient writers understood the world around them. It tells a story of families becoming peoples and peoples becoming civilizations, all within a shared human lineage. This raises a final question worth considering. If the Bible's concern is not race or nationality, but connection and dispersion, what does that suggest about how these ancient texts were meant to be read? Perhaps the story of African peoples in Scripture is less about defining boundaries and more about reminding humanity of its shared beginnings, even as it spreads across the earth. As the biblical narrative continues to unfold, the descendants associated with African regions do not remain static. The Bible quietly acknowledges movement, interaction, and expansion, even when details are sparse. The genealogies in Genesis are not meant to freeze peoples in time. Instead, they offer a snapshot of an early world in motion where families become tribes and tribes begin to shape civilizations. One of the most intriguing aspects of the biblical portrayal of African peoples is how frequently these regions appear in later stories. Egypt is not distant or abstract. It becomes a place of refuge during famine, a center of power, and eventually a symbol of oppression and deliverance. Cush appears at the edges of the known world, often described as distant, wealthy, and formidable. These references suggest that the lands associated with Ham's descendants were well established and deeply woven into the biblical imagination. Yet the Bible never pauses to explain how these societies formed in detail. There are no descriptions of early cities rising from the ground, no accounts of how languages evolved in these regions, and no timelines for migration. This absence is telling. Scripture is less interested in the mechanics of civilization and more focused on meaning, memory, and relationship. Peoples matter because of how they relate to one another, not because of how they differ biologically. This perspective becomes clear when African peoples are viewed alongside other groups in Genesis 10. The descendants of Shem and Japheth are described in similar terms through names that represent both people and place. No line is given priority in the structure of the text itself. All are presented as branches of the same post-flood humanity spreading outward into different regions of the earth. Some scholars suggest that the Table of Nations functions as a kind of ancient worldview map. It does not reflect the world as it truly was in every detail, but the world as it was understood. From this angle, African peoples are not defined by isolation, but by proximity and interaction. Egypt borders Canaan. Cush connects Africa to the lands beyond. These regions form a network rather than a hierarchy. This raises another important question. If Genesis is not attempting to categorize humanity by race, why has the story been interpreted that way in later history? Part of the answer may lie outside the biblical text itself. Over centuries, readers brought their own assumptions, fears, and social structures into the interpretation of Scripture. Ancient genealogies were read through modern lenses, transforming symbolic groupings into rigid categories. The biblical text itself resists this rigidity. It consistently portrays peoples as dynamic. They rise, fall, migrate, and mix. Alliances form across genealogical lines. Conflicts emerge not because of ancestry alone, but because of power territory and human ambition. African peoples in the Bible are neither idealized nor diminished. They are simply present, participating in the same unfolding human story as everyone else. Even the language used to describe lands associated with Africa reflects this neutrality. Cush is sometimes portrayed as distant, sometimes as strong. Egypt is portrayed as advanced, wealthy, and organized, yet also as vulnerable to moral collapse. These descriptions are situational, not inherent. They describe moments in history, not permanent characteristics of a people. Another layer of complexity appears when later biblical writers refer back to these regions. Prophets speak of Egypt and Cush not as abstract ideas, but as known entities with political influence. This continuity suggests that the early groupings in Genesis were remembered as real and significant, even as centuries passed. African peoples remained part of the biblical world long after the genealogies were written. At the same time, the Bible never draws a straight line from these ancient names to modern populations. There is no claim that contemporary African peoples can be neatly traced back to a single ancestor named Cush or Mizraim. Such an idea would have been foreign to the ancient writers. Identity, in their view, was shaped by shared history and land, not by bloodlines measured across millennia. This understanding challenges modern readers to approach the text carefully. When the Bible speaks of African peoples, it is speaking within an ancient framework. It reflects how early communities made sense of human diversity using the tools available to them. To read these texts responsibly is to respect their context without forcing them to answer questions they were never meant to address. Seen this way, the origins of African peoples, according to the Bible, become less about defining who belongs where, and more about illustrating how humanity became diverse after a shared beginning. The flood marks a reset. Genesis 10 marks a distribution. Together they form a narrative of unity, followed by expansion, connection, followed by complexity. This narrative also carries a subtle theological message. If all peoples emerge from the same starting point, then difference is not a deviation, but an outcome. Diversity is not portrayed as a mistake, but as a natural result of humanity filling the earth. African peoples, like all others, are part of this intended spread, shaped by geography, time, and circumstance. As the biblical story moves forward, attention will eventually turn to moments of division that go beyond geography. Language will fracture. Communication will break down. The world will become harder to understand as unity gives way to fragmentation. The origins of African peoples belong to the stage just before that turning point, when humanity is still expanding, but not yet fully divided. In this sense, Genesis presents a world that is diverse but connected. African peoples are not separated from the rest of humanity by walls, but linked through shared ancestry and overlapping histories. The Bible's concern is not to explain every difference, but to trace the roots of human connection beneath those differences. The question left for the reader is not where African peoples rank in a hierarchy, but how these ancient descriptions shape our understanding of identity itself. If identity in Scripture is fluid, relational, and rooted in story rather than biology, then perhaps the true message lies not in categorizing others, but in recognizing shared origins. The Bible's portrayal of African peoples ultimately resists simple conclusions. It offers names without definitions, regions without borders, and histories without closure. In doing so, it invites reflection rather than certainty. The origins it describes are beginnings, not endpoints. And perhaps that is the point. The Bible tells the story of humanity not as a finished map, but as a journey still unfolding with African peoples standing not at the margins, but at the very heart of the ancient world it seeks to describe.